when I was 7 years old, I saw my dead grandmother, and that kind of surprised me and made me question how is it that we can make contact with people who are no longer physical, especially in these kind of borderland sleep states. When I read Journeys Out of the Body, Bob Monroe's first book, I was already having some of my own experiences. I would sometimes wake up with this very strong vibration. I mean, it felt like a train was going through me. So this wasn't a gentle hum in the background. I could look back and see my body in the bed and wander around my room. But this was always like 3 a.m, find himself in the body of somebody else and having another life, and these parallel streams of thought, which is of that person, and also him as an observer, but one wasn't aware of the other, and he didn't quite know what that was. And I've had some experiences like that where I really felt like I was gone for a very long time. And I remember coming back and the track ending. I mean, we're talking a 45-minute track. I thought I'd been gone for days. And we're talking about like how we're using the focus levels now and understanding the focus levels. It's less, they are like radio stations, but you can immediately switch from one channel to another. It's not the dial radio station, it's the button press radio station, right? You've gone digital. and so you
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Ultra Minds podcast with JK Ultra. And as you know, I've been talking a lot about my experience at the Monroe Institute, and there is a very exciting new offering that I know is going to make it available to so many people. So I'm so excited today to get deeper into this with Luigi Sciambarella, who is a facilitator at Monroe Institute. And hello, Luigi. You're actually going to be teaching this self-guided gateway experience that people can do at home. So hello and welcome. And it's so great to meet you.
Yeah, absolute pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
And thank you for coming late in your time zone because
it's only 7. It's perfectly fine.
So can you tell us a little bit about, before we get into this new experience for people to experience Gateway, can you tell us about how you got involved in the Monroe Institute and how you ended up working with them?
How long have you got? Do you want the short version? I'll try to give you the short version. Short version is, and I've told this story elsewhere, so sorry if I'm boring anybody who's heard me before, but when I was 7 years old, I saw my dead grandmother, and that kind of surprised me and made me question, what is this reality really about? How is it that we can make contact with people who are no longer physical, especially in these kind of borderland sleep states, dreaming type territories, and can we initiate that kind of contact? So I got interested in psychology and parapsychology, and I went to study psychology and at university, and I found that the mainstream ideas were essentially that you can't do that, and that was maybe a byproduct of grief as a process or a traumatic response to my grandmother dying, or just a ton of other things that just explain it away, and very heavily reliant on a materialist objectivist paradigm, which says that your neurons fire, and as a byproduct of that, essentially there's this epiphenomenon, this byproduct which we call consciousness and a sense of self, and so that didn't really sit well with me. And don't get me wrong, I mean, anybody who challenges the idea that there is no self, would probably have people thinking, hold on a minute, but what is this that I'm experiencing? But without going into the whole philosophy of that, I thought, let me find out if there's someone else doing anything else, and that led down a particular rabbit hole that led me to the work of Robert Monroe. And when I read Journeys Out of the Body, Bob Monroe's first book, I was already having some of my own experiences that dovetailed quite nicely with some of the things that Bob was having. So things like the vibrational state, this sense of just as I was kind of drifting, or even in the middle of the night, I would sometimes wake up with this very strong vibration that was very, very fierce. I mean, it felt like a train was going through me. So this wasn't a gentle hum in the background, indigestion. This was like a really like bouncing kind of vibration, and just not knowing what that was. And when I read Bob's work, I thought, oh, okay, here's a guy who's systematically studied this state, was having these experiences in the 50s and cataloging them in a very objective way, but and was terrified of the experiences to begin with. Thought he was going crazy, that there was something neurologically, physiologically wrong with him. But then it turned out that he was okay. And so then the question became, well, if it isn't going to kill me, then now what? What do you do with this? How can you explore it? So he applied his curiosity. So I thought, well, if he could do it, then, and he had no reference point back in the day, then maybe I can do this. So I started to get very involved in out-of-body practice, but I found that my out-of-body experiences at the time were a little bit mundane. This is going to sound really weird, but, because there's this kind of perception that you have an out-of-body experience, and then suddenly the keys to multidimensional being just get presented to you, and all the doors are shown to you, and you go through them and you say, wow. It isn't kind of like that for quite a lot of people. You don't always have immediate guides waiting for you to take you to other realities or whatever. For me, it was just going out of my body, or at least that was the sense of connecting with an energy duplicate of a physical form. So it was not my physical body, but something similar in shape, and then moving that somewhere else in my room. And I could look back and see my body in the bed and wander around my room. But this was always like 3 a.m. So nobody was awake, not even students at that point. They usually passed out with the Jack Daniels or drinking or anything else that's a little bit heavier. But, they were out. They were out at that time. So I'd walk around my student halls of residence, and no one would be up. And I didn't want to be a creep and go into people's rooms. So I just walked down the hallway, and there'd be pizza boxes and empty bottles of Jack or whatever. And I thought, well, what do I do with this? And so I'd call out to guides. Nobody responded. And I thought, okay, have I upset somebody? Am I supposed to get guides? I don't know. And then I kind of started to not lose interest, but I thought, I should go back a second and say, when you have the experience of connecting with somebody who's died, then there's already an awareness that death is not the end.
Mm-hmm.
So I wasn't trying to have an out-of-body. If I'd had an out-of-body experience without having had those earlier experiences, then I would say that it would have been more impressive. But I wasn't trying to validate the existence beyond the physical, because I already had an awareness of that. One of the things that we speak about at Monroe is that essentially consciousness is primary and not secondary. That the dominant sort of scientific worldview assumes that consciousness emerges from the brain. Monroe's worldview reverses that, or at least loosens this assumption. The core idea is that consciousness interfaces with the brain, but it's not produced by the brain. So the brain is a receiver or a tuner, that like a radio receiver. So it's an interface. So when I was hearing this, when I was reading about it, I thought, I've really got to go to Monroe and study with them. And I got hold of the Gateway Wave series. At the time, it was 7 waves, and I know now it's 8, but these were the different 7. Then it went to 6, and then it went back to 7, and then 8. But I had the original 7, and I just blitzed through them, and I was having plenty of experiences. And then I wanted to go to actually do the Lifeline program, because I thought, well, I want to carry on that experience that I had with my grandmother and maybe somebody else who's around in that other reality now. So I couldn't do that because you have to do Gateway first. And I thought, I've worked with the tapes, why do I have to do Gateway again? And, this was the prerequisite. And I thought, oh God, these guys, they're so rigid. But anyway, I went along anyway. I did get, and then I realized, okay, it's different. It's different when you do it in person, which I can go into afterwards. But then, I did Gateway, and then my experiences in Gateway actually made me want to go and do guidelines, not Lifeline afterwards. So then I went and did guidelines, and then after that, I thought, why is nobody doing this in the UK? And because it's already in English. And so why isn't this happening? And I found out that Jill and Ronald Russell, who were friends of Bob Monroe's, Russ wrote the biography of Bob Monroe, also helped him to edit his third book, Ultimate Journey. They were long since retired in Scotland, so I went to visit them. And out of those conversations, I thought, I've got to do it myself, haven't I? It's not going to happen. It's just, and so I thought, I wrestled with that for a while, and then I got an email out the blue from my Gateway trainer, saying, "Hey, when are you going to apply to the trainer training?" And I thought, she's either really tapping into something that I'm wrestling with, or she sends that to everybody, and it's a great way of recruiting. But anyway, it worked, and eventually I became a trainer. I've been a trainer since 2010. I was the first in the UK to be a trainer. Now we have, I think, 5 or 6, which is great. And bit by bit, I ended up on becoming a residential trainer, and then being on the board, being the chief R&D officer as I am now, and looking at sort of like research, collaborations and expansion, and all kinds of ways of applying our technology, contributing to the app in terms of putting tracks together and so on. So bit by bit, it's roped me right in. But yeah, I mean, that's the nutshell version. So sorry if that went on a little bit.
No, I love that. And what's really interesting, what I've observed about Monroe and also my experience with it, is that because the facilitators and the people that work there are also going into these altered states, they're picking up on those things. They're getting the insight of like, oh, Luigi might be the person to do this, or how, I was there for the creator program. They came up with the people who were going to be in the creator program by going to focus level 12. And then we happen to like all know each other outside of that just by chance, and they didn't know our relationship to each other. So it was interesting is that because, the people that are working there are also living it as well, the insights come in. But can you explain just really briefly, because you mentioned lifelines and guidelines, and I'm sure people are wondering what those are.
Yeah. Well, so we have an educational pathway at Monroe. Everyone seems to know something about Gateway as being our flagship program, and it's the program that's been running for over 50 years. I think the first one was in 73 or something like that, and so that's not changed too much in that time, in terms of setup. But that's a very kind of broad brush program. It covers all sorts of things to do with the expansion of consciousness. So and the exploration of consciousness and the experience of consciousness. A lot of X words in Gateway. So the goal of Gateway is to train the individual to reduce that external sensory input that can interfere with an awareness of how you can deliberately use your energy, use your consciousness, what you can focus on. And so if you're removing or greatly reducing external radio interference, then you can start to pick up on other channels. And those other channels are what we call the focus levels. So these are different states of consciousness that were mapped by Bob Monroe and his team many, many moons ago. I mean, even started the process before there was a formal Monroe Institute. And certainly the techniques and technology was refined at the Monroe Institute and research there. But these are essentially maps, and they're very vast territories, each of these focus levels. So we just dip into each of those, not all of them, but like 10, what we call mind awake, body asleep, expanded awareness of focus 12, the no time or the potentiality of focus 15, and then the bridge between physical and non-physical realities in focus 21. And we kind of spend like a day in each, maybe slightly over, through the course of the Gateway program. So you get a taste of all of them.
As you know by now, the Monroe Institute is offering the Gateway experience at home. And there's a lot of advantages to doing it at home. First, the price is about 1/5 the price of going in person. And although I'm sure you want to experience it in person, that's actually only the first step. So, Gateway Voyage is actually level 1, which teaches you focus levels 10, 12, 15, and 21. You can use this online program as the prerequisite to then go for the more advanced programs where you go up to level 27 and go to the park. Now, some other advantages of doing it at home is you get to keep the recordings, which is super cool. When I went in person, that's what I wanted to leave with, was I wanted to leave with those recordings. Okay, so here's the really juicy part. Monroe Institute offered me, for my audience, 20% off. Now, that's going to be just for the first 2 weeks that it's available, from March 10th to March 24th, 2026. You get 20% off. That's over $110 off of the price. Now, if it's later than March 24th, if you take a while to decide, or if you're seeing this later, you can still get 10% off using my code GVO-JK Ultra. And that's going to be linked below. Make sure you go check it out because this is a once in a lifetime opportunity.
So that's Gateway. But then if you want to specialize a little bit more, we have what are called the graduate programs. And the first graduate program that was created by Bob Monroe was Guidelines. And this followed on directly from Gateway because he was having his own experiences with InSpec, his own inner guide. You like to give a lot of acronyms to things, but InSpec was short for like intelligent species because he was interacting with this being that seemed to know a lot more than he did. And then, spoiler alert, but, read the books, but it turns out to be an aspect of himself. And so this led him on a journey of saying, well, how can we all start to cultivate an awareness of our inner self-helper? And so Guidelines has more of an OBE component to it. So it does have some signals that support more of the classic sort of out-of-body experience or the phasing process, but especially about cultivating connection with this inner self-helper, what we might call intuition, but just increasing that volume of that intuition so that it's more present in your daily life. So in other words, when you're doing the Monroe, we're trying to gather a group together for the Creator Gateway, then we really want to rely on that part to help guide us in some way. And this isn't, to delegate your responsibility, your agency to a guide, but to have a broader overview, which includes more than just the part of you that operates in this physical reality, or at least a section of this physical reality. When it comes to the Lifeline program, that's a little bit more out there for most people, because that program evolved out of a particular encounter that Bob was part of, but he was also witness to and facilitating, because there was an explorer, as we call them. So this was a volunteer who just wanted to go into the lab and listen to some frequencies that were being played with. And, Bob did this with a lot of people, just to go and find out, like what happens when you play certain frequencies and guide an experience in a particular way. So there was a soundproof room, nice light shielded and sound shielded and so on, so that you have this sensory reduction, or at least external sensory reduction setup. And we have that in our labs that we have at the Monroe Institute. We've got one in the lower part of the campus and one in the upper part. And a monitor, so somebody who's facilitating the session will be in another room but can hear what you're saying and you can hear what they're saying, and you have this two-way communication even when the explorer is having an experience within an altered state. Well, this particular occasion, this explorer connected with somebody who had died but didn't know that they'd died. And so the process was to help facilitate them to move on. Kind of you don't really go in there and say, hey, you're dead, let's move, because that seldom works or is particularly kind and compassionate. But how do you engage with somebody who might be needing some sort of assistance? And I find that there's like two ways of playing the game of Lifeline. And it's hard to tell sometimes which one you're playing. but sometimes it feels like you're connecting with a completely external entity. So someone that has died and has a personal history, and you can get names and dates and all kinds of stuff, which some have been able to do, and the documentaries on that and whatever else. And you just take them to what we call the park, so this rest area, um, which I can go into if anybody's interested. And then the other way of playing the game is that you're meeting an external person or being, but it's actually an aspect of yourself. So it becomes more of like an integration exercise.
Like
So
a parts work type
yeah,
of.
like parts work. Yeah, very much so. So I mean, I work with dreams, lucid dreams in particular. You can be in a nightmare, for instance, and there's a part that's either attacking you, chasing you, running away from you, whatever it is. That will seem external, but it's actually a part of you that hasn't been integrated, that you haven't really communicated with and connected with. So it can do that, and you can get a bit of both. So the game I like to play is whoever I meet, connect with them in some way, send some loving energy connection, try to engage, and so that there's some sort of shared connection and meaning, and then move them along. So it's not just about trying to be a rescue ranger or anything like that. It's what is it that, even if you think, okay, there's something like 130,000 people that die every day. So why that person now for me? What is it that I'm resonating with in that individual that has meant that out of all the people that have died, I'm meeting this person? So there's usually something in it. There's a reason why you're connecting with that person. And so rather than just rush through the process of just taking them to the park, because it's not always necessary, it's more about, let's be curious, let's investigate this, let's connect. So these are just two of the graduate programs, but they build on Gateway. So that's why you have to do Gateway first, and then you can delve in even deeper with these concepts.
Thanks for explaining that. My experience when I was at Monroe is kind of in those, especially the first couple days as I was like first getting into that altered state. There was people popping in, but they were not like people who were seeming like guides or something. They were just like regular people. Like one was just this lady at Disneyland, and one was just and just like kind of popping in
Yeah,
like that. And
people get
I
that.
had asked one of the facilitators, I was like, what is that? Like every time I'm going into this state, there's like, and it seems like they're real people. Like, I'm like, it doesn't seem like they're kind of like a figment of my imagination. They're like, one was at Disneyland, one sitting on her porch, the other one was like walking in a store. And I'm like, what are these kind of mundane things? And then that's how they kind of explained the Lifeline program. And that sometimes when you're going into these altered states, especially, my interpretation of it is that also like Monroe kind of has become a beacon maybe to like the other side. Like it's kind of like a beacon of light where many different things are kind of attracted to that light that's there. And then I was like, oh, wow. Like, and it was not something that I was really interested in initially because I've never really been super connected with like the other side in that way. But then I became very intrigued and I was like, you know what? I actually think I do want to do the Lifeline program.
It's a very interesting program. I mean, it's worth exploring. I must admit, the first time I did it, I wasn't in the right headspace for it for about 3 days, and then something clicked. I'm quite a slow learner, like so I slept the first 2 days of Gateway. So I tend to you tend to get what you need rather than what you necessarily think you want. That's the other thing. So with all of these programs, I just think, yeah, take your time with it. And so and actually, just to kind of go back to an earlier point about the trainers, and what I find is that the trainers do the work on themselves.
Mm.
And one of the requirements of being a trainer is that you carry on taking part in programs. I mean, you top yourself up. You're not just going into this mode of transmit. You can also go into receive and then consolidate and integrate and so on. So it's a regular practice. It's a way of being, and sometimes we lose connection with that for whatever reason. Momentum of life could just drag us out of that energy space, and we get caught up in world affairs and whatever else might be going on in our lives. It could be an illness or something like, so all kinds of things can take us out of center. So then the goal is to recenter yourself. And the way that I find it particularly useful is to tap into those spaces. And then I think, oh yeah, these are problems and things that I have to deal with in my day-to-day. But when I really sink into the appreciation of my deeper being, maybe it isn't as big as I'm kind of thinking it is. And it just puts everything back into its proper proportions. So it's not that you're escaping it or that you're getting away, but you just get a broader view, that greater overview that Bob was talking about as well. That maybe don't sweat the small stuff too much. It all seems important at the time. Engage with it as much as possible, of course, because that's part of why you're here. And also it's maybe not as major as you might think. This too shall pass. That's the saying goes.
It is usually the message, right? Whenever I do the Monroe meditations, or I also do QHHT, whenever like somebody gets into an altered state, their higher self or whatever aspect is speaking through them is always just, it's so simple. It's like, you know what, just let this go. Just stop judging yourself. Just move on. And it's always just like super simple, easier said than done. But it is true, like when you zoom out, that, this is just an experience and it gives you that wider perspective. So I do want to ask you about this new offering, which you are one of the trainers of, and it's super exciting. So now they're going to be offering Gateway online in a self-guided where people can work at their own pace. So can you explain a little bit about that? That's going to be available in March. I believe it starts on March 10th. It's coming up. But so can you explain, like, what is the benefit of being able to do it at your own pace or being able to do it at home?
Well, and I would add, and being able to do it when you're in a guided educational container. One of the things that we've often sort of not struggled with, but just trying to get our heads around is how can we help people to have at home a similar experience to what they have when they come to campus? Because when people are together and they're doing these meditations, and there's an intensity to that because you do several meditations a day, but on campus, we take care of your meals, the timings, it's just, you just show up and show up for yourself, of course, but engage with the group. And they're usually people who are very curious. And there's certain things that you can leave behind. You don't have to necessarily play the same sort of identity game. It's actually quite refreshing when people just introduce themselves, and it's like, my name is Luigi and I'm interested in exploring consciousness and blah, blah. Usually what we do when we meet somebody is say, oh, and what do you do? What's your name? What do you do? And that's not the typical second question at Monroe. So there's some people who are, they could be CEOs of an organization that employs thousands of people, or somebody who's just found out about this. It might be a student or whatever, it doesn't matter. You're all there doing the same thing, which is exploring consciousness from your perspective. And so how is it that when people do that together, they tend to have more amplified experiences? There's a connection, an inner knowing that is more than what they typically get when they just hit play on a track at home. And the technology's been going for 50 years and plus, so we're not concerned so much about the effectiveness of the technology, but what is it that is the process of hemispheric synchronization as a process, not just as a technology. And Bob was, many people have now found out about the Monroe Institute because of the declassified document, right? The CIA declassified document, and there was the army that went there and so on. And then, and you see the term Hemi-Sync being used there. but what Bob was talking about was not the technology or the brand Hemi-Sync. I mean, that was certainly what he then developed it into, but he was talking about the Hemi-Sync process, the process of getting both of your brain hemispheres to work more collaboratively using a sound technology. But the process is the environment, is the set and setting, so what you bring, what you've been thinking about, how you've been building yourself up, how keen and how well rested you are, how, all the sort of psychological and physiological variables, the group dynamics, how the group comes together, the education, the facilitation by the trainers, what you're eating, as well as the technology, and then other X factors that we might not be aware of. The planets are aligned perfectly for you that week or whatever. That is the process. So how much of that process can we start to package up and give to somebody at home? And the technology is just one part of that. So we thought, what is it? Well, when you come to Gateway, it's an educational program. We teach you tools and techniques, and there's a sequence of things that we found over years facilitate access more consistently to these more expanded, rarefied states of consciousness. And that is why we and it's myself and Alan Evans, who's the chief exec, but also a trainer and come up with programs herself like energy medicine, who are facilitating the videos that accompany each of the exercises. We're sort of giving you pointers. This is what tends to work best. You might find your own process, and that's perfectly fine. But this is what people tend to report when they come to Gateway on campus, what they find useful. And we've tried to cover as much of that as possible, including maybe some of the things that people tend to report, but also tend to ask. And it's really tricky to capture all of that because, people ask as many questions as there are people who attend the programs, but there are general themes and so on that, like people clicking out, falling asleep during the exercise and not remembering large swathes of the exercise and then waking up, not knowing what to do. We do a free flow exercise, which is Monroe speak, for an extended period of time, uninterrupted during one of the focus levels. And, they say, well, what do you do when you're listening to these frequencies, and how do I set an intention? What does that even mean? How do I align myself with a particular purpose or meaning in this moment? And so just tips like journaling or whatever it is. So that is really what we've tried to encapsulate as much as possible in this particular course. So you're going through Gateway as much as possible in a way that matches the experience that you would have on campus. And the other thing is that we wanted to make it so that it was super accessible. So obviously when you come to campus, there are big overheads at Monroe. We have to run a mountain with staff and feed you and all that kind of stuff and keep the place running. So there's a cost to that. So with removing that cost, then it just goes down to the tuition, which we're quite happy to provide with the videos, and then the tracks themselves. So when you take part in this program, you can repeat those exercises as many times as you want. The tracks are yours. You can play with them. And we made it with our latest sound technology as well. So it's the focus levels. 10, 12, 15, and 21. But as I said, focus levels are states of consciousness. So the way we're creating them now are still guiding. So it's still layered sound mixes in, we're using Monroe sound science. So it's not just the binaural beats. This is layered sound mixes in a 3D environment, which allows an immersion that allows you to be able to access more consistently these different states of consciousness. And that is something that, of course, you can do it with the original technology. You can also do it this way. This is what we're developing and where our research is taking us now. So that's what we've included here as well. So there's a very neat sound experience as well as a guided educational experience in this that closely matches the campus experience.
I love that. So I had Paul Citarella on
Right.
a couple months ago, and he did explain that, how much the Monroe sound silent science has evolved over the years, and how it's with all of the extra testing and everything that has been done, that now it's even better experience, and also, more conducive to people getting to those states than those original tapes. And also, I like that you brought up being able to go back to it, because that was one of the things. um I didn't click out very much, only a couple times during the program, but there was other people who were in my group who, like you said, everybody gets what they need. This person probably needed a lot of rest, and they were clicking out every time. And so that was one of the things that I thought is cool about being able to do it on your own pace. So,
Yeah.
like, if you are tired that day, because especially when you're doing it live in person, you're going to be tired because it's a very long day. So you're going to kind of click in and click out. And so it's nice, when you're doing it at home, that you can just spend a whole week on focus level 10 versus just that one day. And you can. So one of the things I want to ask you, because I know that you have a lot of interesting, fun information about that maybe we didn't get into when I was in the program, is like,
Okay.
what are other things that you can do at the focus levels? Because I still explore them now that I'm home. But I just need to get kind of creative of like what I want to do. And I was telling you before we came on, like my favorite is focus level 15.
Mhm.
But what are some of the things that, because of course, when you're training someone the first time, you give them the basics of what to do in that, but you don't want to over narrate, because then they don't get to have like a free experience. But what are like some fun things that you can do in the different focus levels?
It's a great question. Um, if you have about 4 weeks, I can answer that fully, so I'll try to cherry pick my way through it. But, just something before we dive into that, you were talking about a participant who kept clicking out in the meditations, and you're absolutely right. A lot of people are quite sleep deprived and don't even know it. When we're sleep deprived, um, it's like being drunk.
Mm.
You go, "I'm fine." You're really not. You need to sleep, and a lot of people, can survive on fumes and minimum levels of sleep, but actually, the stats are pretty brutal, saying that a lot of people are sleep deprived. So your brain, when it gets the opportunity to go into an optimal state, which is part of that sort of synchronization process, it will claw back sleep debt. So that's one thing. But the other thing is that time of day can be significantly different between individuals. I remember getting a phone call, and it's probably about 10 years ago now. It always feels like two, but it can't be. And this person was telling me that he'd been working with the gateway tapes at home for a year every day, and not much had happened. He'd not had an out of body experience or anything of note. And it was getting a bit frustrated, and I congratulated him first of all for sticking with it for a year every day, and only now getting frustrated, or at least reporting frustration now. I said, "Why did you stick with it?" And he said, "Well, I'm getting good sleep, so that I thought, well, that's the result." So I said, "Okay, tell me about your routine." And he said, "Well, I finish work around 5, get home 6, whatever, have dinner, lounge a little bit, and then I'll go to bed, put on a track and fall asleep, wake up in the morning feeling refreshed, but can't remember anything of the track," and so on. And I said, "Okay, that's probably the worst time to meditate, because all of your physical faculties are starting to shut down. You're fried. It's time to rest, recharge, rejuvenate. That's the whole process of sleep and resetting." So I said to him, maybe go to sleep an hour earlier than you normally do, or at least be in bed at that time, and wake up an hour earlier than you normally do, and listen to a track. Try it that way, so that you've got the rest done, and he's not taking any extra time really, maybe an hour earlier in bed. He tried that. Within a couple of weeks, he'd had his first out of body experience. I mean, I'm talking like a classic peel out, hit the ceiling, see your body in bed. And he was kicking himself. He was like, "Oh my God, I've wasted a year." And I said, "No, you were priming yourself. It all goes in. Neurons that fire together wire together. That's the adage. Your brain will have been following the frequencies. However, consciously you weren't with it because you were fried. So now that you've switched it to a morning practice, now you're more refreshed, you're more present in the meditation. You've just come out of that state. So it's a lot easier for your body to move into the background while your mind stays awake. So that's the mind awake, body asleep state, focus 10. So as I go into, what can you do in the different focus levels? Timing is also of the essence here. So a focus 10 practice, after you've had about 4.5 hours worth of sleep, or first thing in the morning, typically, and this is not for everybody, of course, experiment, is more conducive to more of the sort of classic experience, because you're getting your physical body to move into the background while your mind stays present. And so if you reduce your physical sensory input, you'll reduce the story of having to have a physical body, and therefore you're more likely to connect with another story, which is that you're somewhere over there looking back or whatever. You can be at your friend's house or something like that. So it's an excellent state for having out of body experiences, but also just forgetting that non-sleep deep rest. So there's some times where I haven't really got time to nap, but I'll put myself into focus 10 so that I can just feel that my body goes really deeply into rest. I'm still aware of the sounds around me and what's going on. And I don't want to drift too far. I don't want to go into dreaming because I know that I've only got maybe 10 minutes. So then I bring myself out of it. So I use focus 10 a lot when I'm sitting at the gate waiting for a flight and I'm fried and I'm doing a red eye or something like that. It's a great one for just recuperating energy. So that's focus 10. Focus 12, an expanded awareness state, is actually really useful for healing as well. Some people use it, say, for remote viewing or getting information at a distance. Doesn't necessarily have to have the tight remote viewing protocols, but just getting information at a distance, so precognition and clairsentience, clairaudience, that kind of stuff. I'm using the old terminology. But if you're doing Reiki work, you'll probably know focus 12 quite well. So this is an expanded state. You're going beyond your skin line, your physical boundary, awareness, and sort of tapping in. But as a psychotherapist, I tend to use that when I'm working with clients because it kind of just helps me to be on the same page as them. So what energy space are they in and where am I, and have we got a good calibration? It doesn't really matter if you're on Zoom or whatever. You can still extend that connection. So you're going beyond your individual field. And I mean, these field effects are things that we're starting to evidence quite strongly now. There was a paper just recently by Joe Dispenza working with the Global Consciousness Project 2 of HeartMath, showing that when people were sending and receiving healing, that the random event generators were showing less randomness, and we've been doing some experiments with what's called a weirdoscope. So there's weird technologies in the UK that have developed a random event generator that we're using at the Monroe Institute and other locations during programs. And what we're seeing is that, especially when there's opening and closing circles, that the data starts to spike in non-random ways. We just did a retreat about 2 weeks ago, and when the participants were arriving, we saw a spike in the data that was 1,000,000 to 1 against chance. Wow. That is just, I've never seen 1,000,000 to 1. I've seen 800,000 to 1, but it was 1,000,000 to 1. I thought, okay, something significant's going to happen with this group. So we think we're individual, but actually we're in this field and we can measure that. And so the science is catching up with that, which is really neat. And not to say that it wasn't there before. I mean, the experiments of Brenda Dunn and so on at the Pear Lab at Princeton, for instance, were showing these sorts of anomalies. Dean Radin's done tons of research on this and many others, but it's now starting to come out more consistently. And we're doing research on that. Focus 15 now. Okay, so this is your fave. When I did Gateway, I could swear that Focus 15 was not mentioned on the track because I would just click out at 15 every single time. I would do 10, 12, blank, 21, blank, 12, 10. I think 15, are you sure is being mentioned? That I remember getting, just really going back and listening to the Wave series that I had and just thinking, does he say 15? And I just had my eyes open, just staring at a wall going, right. Does he say it? They're messing with me. And then he's going, focus 15. No time, with time has no meaning. And I'm like, oh, he does say it. So, I had to train myself to tune into 15. And although we talk about the numbers in a kind of linear way, they're not linear. These were just almost like generic labels that Bob gave them so that he didn't have to give them esoteric labels. So it's like he just used a numbering system. And the numbers meant something afterwards, with the whole mirror non-cosmology and things that you can read about. But, when he was starting out, it didn't. So 10 was probably because he works with hypnosis, and we use the number 10 a lot in hypnosis, for instance. So you just count to 10 and back again, whatever. 12 was just, well, it's a different state, and we'll leave a gap in case we find something else, which you did actually. Focus 11 is there. And then, but it isn't that the better progressive as so focus 15. When I started to do a lot of lucid dreaming work, focus 15 just started to occur naturally, but it was a state that I would find myself in between dreams. So when a dream collapses, so a lucid dream, in case somebody doesn't know, is a dream that in which you're dreaming while it's happening. So if you've ever had a dream where you saw, hold on a minute, I'm dreaming, that and stayed in the dream, that would be a lucid dream. I mean, you could panic and then the dream collapses. That's still a lucid dream, but very short-lived. So when I'd become conscious of being in the dream, then sometimes I'd be interacting with the dream elements, and then the dream would naturally collapse, and I'd panic. And because it would start to go into this kind of shimmering gray nothingness, and then I either wake up, or I would train myself to just observe that nothingness, and then seed an idea, and then immediately another dream would arise. Or like, you start to do some of the techniques that LaBerge talks about, spin in the dream, you change the environment, it stabilizes you, and so on. So these were the sorts of practices that I had, and I started to notice that there was this in-between space. And then it was reading the work of Tenzin Wangyal Rinpoche, who's a Tibetan dream yoga master, essentially, and the Tibetan Yogas of Dream and Sleep, phenomenal book. And I remember reading about halfway through or something like that, he starts to talk about clear light dreaming. So he's talking about lucid dreaming, and then he's talking about clear light dreaming, and I thought, what the heck is that? And when I started to really dig into it, it really changed my practice. So this is if you're conscious within deep sleep, we all go into deep sleep. We dissolve into deep sleep every night, and then we come into form again in the dream. So there's a character of yourself in the dream, but then it dissolves again into deep sleep. There's no form. If you're conscious within that formless sleep, you're essentially in the clear light. And this is this potentiality, or the void. But the void doesn't quite do it justice, because it's the potential for everything that hasn't manifested yet. So in Zen they refer to it as the unborn. It's the potentiality. So I prefer the term the potentiality actually to a no time state, because no time, it's more like time doesn't have meaning in the linear sense. So then people can explore the timeline quite nicely. So if you want to do any sort of regressive work, whether it's past life or in your current life, or whether it's future life work, future pacing and so on, you can do that very nicely. You can even pull into different versions of existence, so maybe show me a life where I'm not me. Might be parallel, who knows, and what can it show me that might be useful in this current incarnation. So you can really start to play around. And what I would find in Focus 15 was that Earth time could be 5 minutes, and Focus 15 time could be hours. I remember having one experience where hard to know where to place it really, but I think it's kind of like a Focus 15 experience. Bob would refer to it as a locale 3, because it was almost like another quantum reality. You know, he would find himself in the body of somebody else and having another life. And it wasn't, you know, you're just saying, what am I doing in here? You know, so there'd be these parallel streams of thought, which is of that person, and also him as an observer, but one wasn't aware of the other. And, you know, he didn't quite know what that was. And I've had some experiences like that, where I really felt like I was gone for a very long time. And I remember coming back and, you know, the track ending. I mean, we're talking a 45-minute track. I thought I'd been gone for days. You know, really, I had so many experiences and just mundane life things. I mean, interesting, but like, you know, just somebody going to work and just working on a particular project, and nothing deeply meaningful or symbolic. Or, you know, I work a lot with meaning, symbolism in dreams, archetypes, and so on. It just a general life that somebody was having, and I really lived every moment of that. And yet when I came back, in the track itself, it probably would have been about 20 minutes worth, if that.
Wow.
You know, so I was like, "What? How long have I been gone?" And my wife's looking at me like I've got 3 heads. The usual. She usually looks at me like I've got 2, but I thought it was 3. And I thought, you know, what day is this? It's like today's Christmas Day, so you know, it was really weird. It was really weird experience, and I mean, I've had many weird experiences, but that was pretty far out there, because I've never really been displaced in time so much as with Focus 15, and 21. And I mean, I could go on for hours with Focus 15 alone, but with 21, because it's a bridge between physical and non-physical realities, it's a fantastic space for making contact with those that are no longer physical. So I have had experiences with my grandmother again, and granddads, and a granddad who I'd never met because he died before I was born, and great grandparents, and you know, so I've a friend of mine who died a couple of years ago. I met him as clear as day, you know, just in that space. So it's a powerful state. It's a powerful state of consciousness where the beauty is that, you know, there's this kind of idea that you have to separate from your physical body and then go to that place. That's not the mechanism. You just put your awareness somewhere and you're there. This is you know, cut out the middleman, the out of body dude. You know, make another body that's the carrier to go into these spaces. You can just put your mind there and you're there instantly. And this is, you know, what Bob Monroe came to understand, and that's why he made what he called the phasing model of consciousness. So, you know, when we're talking about like how we're using the focus levels now and understanding the focus levels, it's less, they are like radio stations, but you can immediately switch from one channel to another. It's not the dial radio station, it's the button press radio station, right? You've gone digital, and so you can fire it up that way. You know, you don't have to pass through this sequence in order to get from one to another. You can be there instantly. Bob referred to that as the quick switch method, and I found that to be very, very effective. You can go into an out of body from a lucid dream and vice versa, for instance, or you can go from a lucid dream to maybe a park experience or a Focus 21 or 27 experience. So, you know, there's a lot more fluidity in movement in these different realities than people typically, even when they're okay with thinking that they can explore these spaces, that they still have a kind of left brain structure to how they have to do it, and that's not necessarily the case for everybody.
Wow, so there were so many things that you mentioned. So, you know, one thing that I thought was really interesting was you mentioning kind of real life application of these things. So, you know, when I've thought about Monroe, it's really been more about exploration or healing or, you know, spiritual or consciousness. But, you know, you were talking about like using it as a therapist or using it in a healing practice. So like really, I didn't ever think about accessing these focus levels in those types of ways so that it could benefit other types of practices, not just for fun or exploration, but for people's work or, you know, was there any other type of things that you would suggest
Well,
as
I
an
mean,
example of people it would benefit?
one of the key things is like, how are you talking to yourself? You know, this is one of the things that comes out of like doing, say, the guidelines program. Do you think your guidance thinks you're a loser? Does it think, oh, come on, you should have a better car by now, or put all these conditions of worth on you? I mean, no, it doesn't. And people are often surprised by how much that guidance is just flowing to you anyway. There's It's unconditional. There's a loving connection. It's unconditional. It's compassionate. It wants to reduce your suffering. And so with that, we can say, well, when I move into these states in the daytime, how am I talking to myself while I'm trying to move into these states? Am I saying, okay, well, when I get into these states, then I'll be okay. And so if I'm not, then I'm not okay. It's a subtle thing, but it's a way of saying that there's something wrong with me unless I'm different. And that's not what happens. When you tap into greater sources of being and intuition and non-local perception and, access to deeper self structures. So it helps with emotional self-regulation, I think. When we can keep going into these spaces, we have so much conditioning that is so insidious and subtle as well, that we tend to think that it's absolute and this is how it must be. Fear messages. Bob dedicated a whole chapter to fear in Journeys Out of the Body, about 15 chapters in, something like that, midway through the book anyway. He dedicates a whole chapter to fear, and he says this is the real limiter to exploration. And there's several fears. There's fear of death, which is probably the primary one. The fear of the unknown, which relates to the fear of death, because if you don't know it, maybe it can kill you. Which then relates to how we see ourselves and others. So there's loss of identity as a fear. Who am I if I don't hold on to my identity in some way? If I've been telling myself this is how I'm supposed to live, and anybody who's not living like this is getting it wrong, but I'm okay and I'm right. It's not that I'm okay, but I'm right and I'm doing it better than others. So I've acquired more wealth. I've acquired more people and prestige and accolades or whatever it is. There's nothing wrong with all of those things, but it's the self that's identified with those things that can be limiting. Then if you then move into a space that says, yeah, that was nice that you did that, but that isn't the only thing, that isn't the most important thing, then you go, crap, who am I then? And there's a loss of identity. There can be a fear of the actual expanded states themselves. What does it mean if my construct of time isn't what I thought it was? That's a biggie. And so fear constrains perception. It adds filters to perception, and reducing fear allows exploration. And that's what we're trying to do here. So when people have experiences with the focus levels and they can train their consciousness in very deliberate ways, then they usually report psychological and existential shifts, and often report reduced death anxiety, increased life meaning, greater emotional stability. I mean, these are just some of the things. And even though you might grieve the loss of somebody who's died, because, physically you're not going to be able to connect with them in the same way. You can't just pick up the phone and have a chat with them. Of course, I grieve my friend who died a couple of years ago. I mean, it was an intense grief. We worked so close, but to know that he was okay was a great feeling. I mean, when I had that connection with him a few months after he died, that was remarkable. I remember waking up and just like coming back to my body, and there was tears streaming down my face, but they were joy. I thought, yeah, he's all right and he's here, and a beautiful connection. I remember one guy who had an experience during one of the exercises in the lucid dreaming program that I teach with Thomas Hassenberg, who's a trainer in Germany, or he's German, he lives in Thailand now. But this guy, he was quiet all the way through the debrief. Like everyone was inputting something, and then at the end of it, he said that during the meditation, he was taken completely off piste because he met his dad, and his dad was really concerned I'm not sure what this space is, what I'm doing here, and a bit disoriented. And his dad was in the physical, by the way, and but unwell. And he reassured him and he said, "Dad, I think you've died." And because literally a tunnel had emerged, all right? And he said, "I don't know what I'm supposed to do." And he said, "I think you're supposed to go through that tunnel, but I'll come with you." And he accompanied his dad through that tunnel to the other side, where he was met with other relatives and there was a warm reception. And I get goosebumps, because it was such a powerful experience when he was really, you could hear a pin drop in the room, by the way. We were all in this sense of awe of what we'd witnessed. And he'd helped his dad through that transition process. He made his way back because he had to go back. And then he came out of the experience and he finds that his phone, which was on silent, had about, several missed calls. And I think his sister had tried to call him. And while he was in the meditation, his dad had died.
Wow.
So we were like, I mean, this is when like expletives go through your mind. Like, what are the words that,
Right.
it's like, wow. And so he said, I've got everything I needed, but I have to go back now, obviously. But what a beautiful gift,
Mm.
to be able to support, a loved one, a parent, through the transition process.
If you've been interested in going to the Monroe Institute, then Gateway Voyage Online is an excellent opportunity. Not only is it 1/5 of the price of going in person, but it also qualifies you for the graduate programs. So you can go in the future to those graduate programs in person. Now, getting to do Gateway Voyage for 1/5 of the price plus 20% off using my code GVO-JK Ultra, that gives you 20% off up until March 24th. After that date, it will be 10% off. This is a once in a lifetime opportunity to learn level 1. It qualifies you to go in person, and you get to keep the recordings forever. You get to spend as much time as you want on each level, and you get to do it as many times as you want. So, definitely an incentive of acting sooner rather than later. But as I said, 10% off anytime that you see this.
And people who've had near-death experiences and sometimes shared death experiences report things like that, that actually death is safe. So when you've got that sense of safety, then what's this life about? All the things that we're like, oh, trying to protect ourselves from being demolished and destroyed and whatever, a lot of it is that, like, I need to gather this kind of barrier and resource type. Then that's part of a game, but half of your head needs to play that game as well, because half of your head is
Right.
designed for survival, right? But another part of you knows much more than that, and can connect with that. And it's not that you need to die in order to make that connection, although that will happen then more than likely. But you see it in the TED Talk or book by Jill Bolte Taylor, My Stroke of Insight, where she had that left hemisphere stroke, which took out that faculty that is about fight or flight and survival. And I mean, not took it out, but massively reduced it. And she was then in that interconnected flow of being. It's like, actually where I end and the environment begins is a blur.
Mhm.
It is all one. And I'm at a perspective within that oneness. And it's not that you have to get rid of that perspective to be in that oneness. It's all there all the time anyway. And one of the things that I find really useful about the work that we do at the Monroe Institute is that to be whole brain, to go through the process of hemispheric synchronization, means that we don't just abandon the left hemisphere, a critical faculty, the storyteller, the bit that's about concepts and constructs. We don't abandon that, but we expand it so that it includes the awareness and perspectives that are present within the right hemisphere, or at least that has access to it more easily. And therefore we can be in both ways of being at the same time. We're all one and we're separate at the same time. It's both. It's not one, it's not either or. And sometimes we can lean more into one than the other at different times in our lives. But this is really for me, this is like a consciousness evolution, and it's an ongoing process. Monroe viewed human life as a part of a developmental arc, and this isn't necessarily moralistic, but it's an awareness and an integration kind of process. So you're increasing self-awareness, you're integrating fear and fragmentation, you're expanding beyond the egocentric identity, which has been useful, but it's limited as well. And look at what the whole identity politics is me versus somebody else. It's my tribe versus your tribe, and that has a place, but it's very limiting and sometimes incredibly destructive. So there's greater coherence, there's greater stability of consciousness when we start doing this work. So it's about trying to just shift that worldview that you are not a body that has consciousness. You're a consciousness temporarily phasing into an awareness of a physical body. So your identity, your perception, and potential extend far beyond what ordinary waking awareness suggests. And what you do with that is entirely up to you. And at the Monroe Institute, we provide the tools and the techniques for people to explore what that means for them.
And that's, I think, one of the most interesting things when I experienced it was, a lot of people get interested in Monroe basically for like the out of body and the exploration side. And most of us, when we were coming back to these debriefs after the meditations, was kind of coming back with the most simple messages of like, we all just need to be kinder to each other. We just need to love ourselves more. And it was just so interesting that, you think that and not that people don't have these very profound experiences that are also sometimes out of body, sometimes with aliens, sometimes with past loved ones, sometimes out of time and space. But really, I think that like everyone's biggest takeaway from the group that I was in, and also, people that I've heard that have done it in other groups said that like really it was like this like self-love and compassion and this like interconnectedness that was the biggest thing that they got out of it.
Right. And that's something that I see every time I do a program as a facilitator and as a participant. There's something that emerges which is greater than the sum of the parts. You can't just see the participants and think, oh, okay, this is what's going to emerge. You don't know. So the tracks have been pretty much the same for 50 years. Okay, we've been developing things and cleaning things up in the sound mixes and whatever else, but the sequence is pretty much the same. But every gateway that I've taken part in is different, and you might listen to the same exercise repeatedly and get a very different experience each time. So this is, I sometimes find this interesting because the friend of mine who died, he was a Buddhist and been practicing for 50 years. He was blown away by the technology and he was totally using it. So, including in his practice. But I said to him, I said, like we've got so many meditations. I mean, there's just like thousands of them. I mean, in the Expand app, I think we're at 150 or something like that. These are all guided. And he's saying, when I was in the order, we did 3. We did 3 meditations. There'd be a loving kindness meditation. There'd be, like a metta bhavana, the sending love to, maybe a guru yoga type of meditation, and then something like a mindfulness practice of some kind, and then okay, yeah, there's different chants and whatever else. But you do 3 for 50 years, so they get richer each time. You don't always have to learn new things. It's sometimes the same message, but from a different level of appreciation, a different level of understanding. This is, what I often find. So yeah, you need to talk to yourself in a more kind, compassionate, loving way. And you go, yeah, I get that. But actually, when you really connect with that, what does that really mean to you? What would it mean if you did that and then do it and then notice what shifts? I mean, it sounds like a simple message, but it's certainly not simplistic. So we go, oh, it sounds like a Hallmark card, well, whatever. And we just dismiss it. No, but that can't be it. He's supposed to tell me how bad I'm doing at something and give me corrective action. It's not an auditor. Right, it gives you a non-conformance report and says, right, do this, fix this. I mean, sometimes people do get very clear messages like that, but it's still done in a loving way. When people have near-death experiences where they're having life reviews, it's very rare that they're being judged externally. It's often an inner judge that's saying, oh, I wish I'd done this differently and so on. But actually, they're surrounded by support saying that's what you did at your level of development. And hindsight's a beautiful thing. But also a destructive thing. I can say, oh, well, you should have done that better. Well, I didn't know that at the time. Yeah, so we kick ourselves in the past, because of something that we just didn't know about. And if we do that with ourselves, then who else in the past, for instance, are we beating up because they had a limited perspective at the time? And there's lots of people around now that we might find very antagonistic, but then get yourself out of harm's way if that's what it creates. But they're a product of that process as well. So what is it that we can be doing slightly differently? And this is why, at Monroe, we have this mission of trying to reach 80 million people by 2030 with a 2032 with a direct experience of being more than their physical bodies, that we're reminded of our interconnectedness. If we can evidence not only that your brain starts to synchronize to a particular frequency, which we can evidence, and that we can train that more rigorously, which is what we're doing with current studies, that there's field effects. So when people come together, there's non-randomness in supposedly random data streams, so something happens, we're affecting the field in some way. Then what are we deliberately putting out there? When I think I'm just in my head, am I contributing just to my head, or am I contributing to a field? And now that you might start to know that, I'm contributing to a field, then how do you want to show up in your life, and knowing that it has an impact on not only yourself, but the wider environment as well? So what is it that you want to cultivate? And this is really, just like a field, you can plant lots of seeds and you can water things, or you can let weeds grow, I mean, can we be more deliberate in curating that field and be less passive, just victim mindset, So, and if things have happened, then, okay, well, how can I assume some authority and responsibility for my life, my choices, and maybe things have happened that are difficult. Yeah, okay. And what perspective do I take from that? What meaning do I make from this? And how do I want to move forward? So, as much as possible, what we're trying to do is empower at least those 80 million to be able to be more deliberate in their lives and remember that interconnectedness. So kindness, I think, and loving connection is almost like a natural byproduct of that process.
Right. And so it is amazing that you guys are now going to be able to do it in a way, because, you have before groups of 12 or 15. It's hard to get to a million
Yeah, it's a
people
drop in the ocean, isn't it?
when
You know?
when you're doing that group at a time. So now it's like people all over the world can be doing it and, have access to it. It's super accessible. I know that it's coming out March 10th, and then it's ongoing available for whenever people
Yeah.
want to jump in on there. Also, it's great that they get to interact with you and get to see before trying the online course, because you're one of the trainers. And so, they kind of get to know you already. We could talk for hours. I have like a million more questions for you.
No problem. But I mean, the other thing is, because we're doing this as the taught version of the program, like, to mimic essentially what we do on campus, when people have completed this version of Gateway, then they can go to the graduate programs afterwards.
Wow. I actually wanted to ask you that. So
Yeah.
it's a
Yeah.
great way for people who want to do Lifeline or Guideline, or they have MC Squared, which is super fun. I've heard. I want to do that one too. And so that's awesome. That's also what I wanted to ask you, is if doing this home course then allows them to do
Yeah.
those. So that's
Yeah,
very
because
cool.
you've taken part in the educational program. You know how to work with the tools, and it's not just hitting play on the tracks. So as long as you work through the material and Yeah, I mean, you can revisit as many times as you want any of the exercises, but as long as you've worked through the whole course, then you'll have the foundation to be able to then go on to the other programs, whether it's online, because we have what we call the virtual retreat. So that's when everybody kind of meets on Zoom and then goes away, listens to the track, comes back, and so it's a live taught thing, or actually a campus experience, a residential experience. So yeah.
Very cool. Well, Luigi, thank you so much. There was so many things that you mentioned that I'm also going to look up now about some of this kind of in between dream state. I'm really interested in that.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for all your
Thank you.
wisdom.
Thank you.
And
Thank
I'm
you.
going to be taking the self-guided course, doing it again for fun. So I'll also be tuning in that way.
Yeah, thank you. I'll see you on there.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Wow, you made it to the end of the episode. Congratulations. That tells me something about you, that you enjoy long form content. So I think you might enjoy this YouTube channel. You might want to like, subscribe, because that's what we do around here. On Ultraminds podcast, we do long form conversation with some of the leading minds in spirituality, consciousness, astrology, and more. But every Tuesday night, what we do is a Tuesday night live where I do a solo long form conversation, interacting with the comments, answering questions. And overall, what we're doing here on this page is deconstructing a lot of spiritual bypassing type of values and exploring consciousness through a new lens